I mean, we have like well over 1,200 formulas at B&B. So usually when someone's like, "Do you have an acid wash?" I'm like, "We have five of them." They're like, "Do you have a pH neutral soap?" I'm like, "We've got close to 100." Silicon carbide, that's the newest thing. Chris, we need a silicon carbide coating. Why haven't you developed this? The nano diamonds, you're like, "This has diamonds in it." They're like, "They said this has diamonds in it." This thing is literally made of diamonds. This is a can of 100% carnauba. And I'm like, "No." Like, that's not true. And then we get, people that kind of get educated and go, "Hey, I think this is kind of bullshit."
My guest this week is Chris Gallahar, the CTO and the main chemist at B&B Blending and Adams Polishes. Chris is an actual chemist that formulates car care products. So I have a bunch of questions. Some of you guys send me your question. So we're gonna dive deep in some of the subject, and we're probably gonna have him for a few more episodes during the following months. So I hope you enjoy this one, and let's jump right into it.
All right, Chris, to start off my podcast, I usually like to put a listener question first to front load some engagement. And the first question is, as the chemist of detailing products, what is the most annoying misconception that you face on a weekly basis?
I would probably say that has to do with pH. You get a lot of people that think, pH of 14 versus pH of 13, 12. It's like literally a strength meter or something like that. In reality, it's the amount of hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions you have in solution, and it's very dependent on what's causing that pH, right? So something that's a pH of 3 but has no buffering capacity isn't going to be as strong as something else that has a pH of 3 but has a very high buffering capacity. And what I mean by that is how much the pH wants to stay at that pH. So you can have ingredients in the blend like sodium metasilicate that will hold the pH at close to 13 no matter how much you dilute it. So that's how we make products that are concentrated, and they keep the pH at a stable point despite we saying dilute it 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. But something that has that buffering capacity is more likely to cause damage to surfaces or be too strong if you don't dilute it because it's got that buffering capacity, whereas something else that's a mild alkaline pH or acid pH, like a weak organic acid, won't damage things like a hydrofluoric acid will. So when someone says, "This is a pH 12, this is a pH 13, the pH 13 thing's going to work vastly better than the pH 12," I'm like, that's not necessarily true. So that's usually one of those like pet peeves of mine.
So when I'm talking in my videos or other content creator, when we talk in general about pH, are we just spinning our wheels here? Like meaning that if I have like two pre-washed product, one is pH 10 and the other one is pH 13, without knowing the ingredients or the chemistry behind it, would you say that it doesn't matter in the end? It doesn't show anything?
It's all in context, right? So everything in context. So something like a weak chelate that's in the formula might hold the pH at 10, but as soon as you dilute it even slightly, your pH is going to basically move right to the water, right? So you'll get a pH of 7 or 8. Something that's intentionally alkaline has caustic potassium hydroxide or something like the metasilicate, like I said earlier, or tripolyphosphate. It's going to want to hold the pH at a given value. So to some extent, yes, like taking the pH is one piece of the puzzle. Without having it in context, it doesn't tell you the whole story is all.
Okay, okay. Well, I can't wait to dive into those things. I have many questions for you coming up, but before we dive into the nitty and gritty, can you give us a quick background and how did you get started into the detailing industry?
Sure. I originally went to Colorado School of Mines in Golden. It's a STEM school, so science, technology, engineering, and math. I started off as a chemical engineer, really liked the chemistry classes, the organic chem, theoretical, inorganic, stuff like that. Really did not like the engineering, thermo, heat transfer, mass and energy balances. Talked with my faculty advisor, and they were like, "Well, if you don't like the engineering part, you're going to be doing this an awful lot as a chemical engineer." So I switched tracks to a chemistry route, and I did an emphasis in biochemistry because I worked as a nurse's aide in hospitals and nursing homes with Alzheimer's patients. So I wanted to get into um, kind of biochemical sort of tracks of like, why does Alzheimer's cause what it does? And I was interested in virology and stuff like that. Well, getting out of school, I had a lot of student loans built up, not a lot of time to go to something like a master's degree or a PhD. So I ended up working in industry. Um, for a long time, I worked at Amgen, which is a big biotech pharmaceutical company. Eventually, the site here in Colorado wound down. Got a job offer for a small blending company in North Glen, which is like northern Denver. Interviewed with Bob and Roman, kind of self-taught chemists on a lot of this automotive formulation stuff. And when I talked with Roman in my interview, he was like, "How often do you detail your car?" I'm like, "I don't think I've ever detailed my car." And he's like, "Have you ever washed your car?" I'm like, "I've gone through a car wash a few times." And he's like, "You ever polished a vehicle?" I'm like, "Not on my life." And he was like, "Yeah, you'll figure it out. We'll teach you or whatever." I was a good enough like cultural fit, and I showed enough like interest and attitude. So, um, as kind of the story goes, once you start learning about these things, you get really kind of, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So then I'm like showing my wife, like walking through a Target parking lot. And I'm like, "Look at all the swirls on that vehicle." And she's like, "Yep, looks like a car. It's pretty shiny." I'm like, "It's not shiny. It's all swirled." Like, looking into abrasives and emulsion chemistry, I'm like, it's not that complicated. And as you start to break down a compound, you're like worried about abrasives, their morphology, their particle size distribution. How do you balance the water and oil sides? What do you have in the oil sides to make the flash points and evaporation quite right, giving you the right lubricity? And it's like, as you can imagine, you're like, okay, so once you turn the rock over, it's considerably more complicated. So now I, like a lot of your listeners, are very interested in maintaining the appearance of my vehicle. It's an extension of who I am. It's an extension of my home, and it represents me. And it's just very cathartic to have the opportunity to work on my vehicle and like really correct the surfaces, get the hydrophobicity, and just take some time to slow down and wash a vehicle is a lot of fun to me now.
Would you say that as times goes on, you got the detailing passion?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like I said, it's like once you kind of get into it, you can't really get back out of it. Obviously, being involved in the industry for about the last 11 years, I do a lot of uh, conversations with various influencers and YouTube folks such as yourself. But I'm also just a student of the industry, and I'm watching a lot of different brands and different detailers showing their craft and honing their trade. And um, yeah, so the passion definitely came from once I became a chemist in this industry and got to learn everything. It's it's something that I think is a lot of fun, and I think it's very interesting, and I think there's still a lot more to learn about it too.
First off, I want to start with we've been seeing the same old type of product: tire dressing, shampoo, ceramic coatings. Everyone are claiming ease of use. They're claiming long durability, and now we have seen a big wave of PPF stuff. So right now in 2025 or going forward, what trends are you seeing that is going to shape the industry, or what change are you maybe expecting coming soon?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, being in the industry as long as I have, I've seen a lot of like waves of changes. Um, we've talked about it, Adams, on a few videos, but going from waxes to sealants, polymers, coatings, etc. Um, things tend to progress in kind of what I would say is fits and bursts. Um, we're obviously, as formulators, always working on iterative improvements to the formulas, continuous improvement. So even if it is another soap, as people say, there is usually some sort of interesting technology built into that. There is something that we're trying to accomplish. There is something about the process we're trying to improve. Um, but a lot of it, just like in science, we're dependent on kind of the state of raw material manufacturers as well. So as myself as a formulator, I'm not a synthesis chemist. I'm not in the lab making the latest and greatest surfactant, but I'm using the ingredients that other chemists are creating. So I take what someone else synthesized and I make it commercially viable in an end use application for a consumer. So to some extent, sometimes we're hamstrung by what is available, right? Like if we've researched and done things with all of the latest and greatest raw materials and we've kind of feel like we've maximized them or optimized them, sometimes you can look into other industries and find new novel raw materials that maybe aren't getting any attention in the car care space. A lot of these raw material providers will show you a catalog and say this is our car care chemistry. One thing we're pretty adamant about is like we reach into cosmetics and stuff because it's a very competitive industry and there's a lot of new raw materials being slung at those folks to make a lot of money for people's cosmetics. So long story short, it's essentially we can't create new things if we don't have any new things to create with. So like you said, we've seen a lot of things going on with PPF. I think the rinseless stuff has been kind of prominent, especially with like water restrictions and more people not being able to buy homes and things like that, living in apartments or condos where they may not have access to water or they may not be permitted to put things down the drain. So rinseless washing or wireless washing has become a lot more important. Coatings and PPF, I feel like, are slowly starting to merge. You have a lot more people putting more time and energy into learning and doing PPF, simply because there's certain things that PPF can do that the liquid chemistries can't. But I'm seeing more and more about like scratch hiding technologies, self-healing technologies, those sorts of things is what I think is coming up next.
Yeah, sometimes on my end, at least, when I look at a new brand or a new catalog, it's all the same product that we know, the tire shine, the soaps, the dressing here, dressing there, or the spray sealant and all that stuff. And sometimes I'll get the whole lineup and I'll start trying it, and then I'm gonna see a difference. But just looking at it on a website, it doesn't tell me everything. It doesn't tell me much of anything. And once you start trying those products, that's where I guess the difference or the new factor comes in.
I think that's like kind of trying to marry the technical with the marketing, right? So for marketing, there's very much like a series of products they're trying to match or compete with, et cetera, in the market. As a technical person, we're trying to make sure we've covered all the bases from a process standpoint. You know, we don't want a brand to have a big gap, right? Where they have to go reach for another company's product in order to fulfill a need in a process. So as long as the process remains the same, you can kind of expect a lot of the products are going to remain the same. So that's a big important reason why as a formulator, I'm watching videos of how people go through the process, how-to videos on how to detail, because I'm always looking to see if something about the process changes or evolves. Because if that does, then sometimes there's an opportunity for a chemistry to basically dovetail into that or fix that or improve it or make it more efficient. Some of why you see so many of the same, why does everybody have the same tire shine? It's like because
So
tire shining is part of the process.
at the chemist level or at the brand level, you pay attention to those things to get inspiration.
I think so. I think, if you're a good formulator, I think that's a responsibility with the job. It's certainly my part of my job as the CTO at my organization is to be in the weeds, interacting with folks like yourself, with the community, understanding what the market wants and needs, understanding where there's gaps or somebody's basically not answering the market that wants something. So like we'll talk about it later, but like hydrophilicity is something that I think is an untapped part of the market.
So let's talk a little bit about Adams since you mentioned it. In the previous years, maybe like 3 years ago, we've seen Adams coming out with a new lineup, the graphene lineup, a lot of products going in the market. And now I haven't seen Adams coming out with like an improved version maybe of the ceramic coating. Uh, does our ceramic coatings have reached a plateau of some kind?
My product recommendation for this week is Armor Detail Supply Adapt. It's an SiO2 base waterless wash that smells really good, that works really well, doesn't streak, and I like to use it as an emergency product for bird poo, massive big splash, or anything that lands on the paint I want to get rid of in a quick and easy way. So really nice product as well for your door jam. So go check it out on the houseofrags.com and .ca. using the code Dogma to save you some money. And let's get back into the video.
To some extent, yeah. So again, there's a very strong interplay between marketing, commercialization, the technical. We have a pretty robust pipeline at Atoms of products we're always working on and projects we're always doing. So some of them might be related to continuous improvement. Some of them might be related to new product launches. Once in a while, you get a little bit of a lightning strike, with something like the graphene lineup where a presentation I gave in a meeting is like, hey, we have this new type of resin. This is what we were trying to accomplish. What do we think about that? And you'll get the right kind of timing with the marketing team that they're like, ready to do a big push and do something big and new. But they also are conscientious of their consumer and they don't want to flood their consumer with the latest and greatest new every couple weeks, right? There's sort of an ebb and flow to the market. To me, I see it a lot like stocks and things where you're going to have an inflection and then you're going to have a consolidation period and then you're going to have another inflection. But sometimes it's I guess I'll relate it to an iPhone is you have an iPhone 12, 13, 14, 15. It's like you can either wait and go from an iPhone 12 to a 16 and have kind of a jump in technology, or you can come up with this iterative improvement and this constant slow drip of new products. And sometimes, depending on the psychology of it, you might exhaust the consumer with, hey, it's another year. You're going to need to go take everything in your cabinet and toss it and get all the new. Some people like that. Some detailers are like, I just constantly bouncing around between brands because I want to try new things, which I think is really cool. And it's something I do as well. But then other people will yell at us when we launch new things and go, why do you need this? The other thing already works great. I don't need another soap. This soap works fantastic. Quit screwing with us by coming up with something else and telling us we need this new thing. So you'll get some pushback from the market if you try and launch too many new things too often. And you'll get consumers telling you, hey, quit trying to like attack my wallet and just give me something tried and reliable and consistent and make it available. I don't need some new fancy label on it. I don't need some new fancy claims. And so sometimes it's like people will look down their nose at legitimately new, interesting technologies that we've developed because they see it as like kind of a marketing ploy. So we have a lot of those conversations internally too of like, why did this not go so well? And it's like, well, because the way we marketed it, it looks scammy or it was too soon or it basically cannibalized this other SKU. So we look greedy. When in reality, what we were trying to accomplish was a legitimately interesting new thing that we were trying to show the market. So there's definitely kind of a cadence to all these things, and there's definitely some psychology at play.
Okay. So customers are different. They're not created equal.
And they're fickle.
I want to ask you, since you mentioned like looking at what we do, I've seen a rise for the pre-washing, the pre-wash product. For myself, I really enjoy using those type of products, even in the summer. But for the winter, I feel like they are somewhat mandatory. The cars in the Northeast are getting really, really dirty.
Totally agree.
And correct me if I'm mistaken, but I have not seen Adams having a dedicated, like, strong quote unquote pH, not pH, but a pre-wash product.
Yeah, so that I think it was probably last February that, or maybe even the February prior to that, like 2023. Time moves fast. We updated strip wash. So as usual, bunch of people, why did you change the strip wash from alkaline to acidic? Well, the goal there was to build it into a dedicated pre-soak while also being something that you could attack salts with. So going back, all the way back to the pH thing I talked about at the very beginning, you're going to want to use alkaline pH to get rid of things like bugs and other sorts of organic contaminants. And you're going to need to reach for acids for things that are inorganic contaminants like mag chloride or sodium chloride or different sort of salts that are on the roads that keep them from freezing. The reason for that is you have to solubilize those salts. And if you can't solubilize those salts with an alkaline product, you need to reach for an acid one. So there was a big educational thing I had to do at the time at Adams, especially around if you're trying to make an acid or a salt wash, you actually need to use acid because they would be using stuff like Salt Away or Salt Terminator or something like that up against our at the time alkaline strip wash, and they were like, it seems like the salt remover stuff's working considerably better. I was like, did you check the pH? And they're like, yeah, one's acidic and ours is basic. And I'm like, right, because the basic's going to be really good for like a strip wash or a bug remover or kind of summertime use, and the acid wash is going to be better for your wintertime use. And really, you kind of need both. But at the end of the day, pre-soaks and things have existed for as long as detailing has existed. I think maybe something about the process or something about the tediousness or the work of washing the vehicle multiple times doesn't appeal to marketers, so they don't want to push those types of products for whatever reason. But it's something the technical group at Adams especially has always said, can we have some pre-soaks? And the marketing team's like, maybe not yet. So it's one of those things. We've had the answers. It's just whether we want to market those or not. But I'm in your camp where I think a pre-soak goes a long way to make your wash more effective, get a more thorough clean, so that things like your clogged coatings don't look like they failed prematurely. But also to avoid scratching the surface, you got to get a lot of those larger contaminants off.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the main point why I use them, because the lower parts of the car, behind the wheels, the bumper, the trunk lid, gets so much grit there.
We run into that a lot, traveling up I-70 into the mountains to go skiing or something like that. You'll come back and your car will just be filthy and it's covered in a lot of salts. And I think anyone that's detailed for a while will know going after it with a mitt and just a pH neutral wash is probably not the bestest of ideas.
No, but you guys must have that in your lineup at B&B. They're just not implemented with Adams yet.
Yeah, again, it's the way it kind of works with Adams and B&B is I run a technical team of chemists at B&B and we formulate for hundreds of brands. Um, and at Adams, I run a technical team that's focused on that brand specifically. So what I'm doing at B&B doesn't necessarily happen at Adams, vice versa. Sometimes they'll get some cross-pollination going on, but in other cases, I try and run the two teams fairly autonomously and independently, because what Adams is doing isn't necessarily just watching what B&B is doing and cloning it. They have their own plan, they have their own thought process. They're appealing to their own consumer in their own way. Um, B&B caters to a lot of professional detailers, wagon jobbers, as we call them, or people on like routes, um, body shops, and things like that. All those things don't really apply to an Adams. So what we're doing at Adams doesn't necessarily transfer to B&B and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we're selling lots of pre-soak at B&B, it doesn't necessarily mean Adams feels like it's appropriate or necessary for their consumer.
Because B&B would have them for other brands or for automatic car washes. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, we have like well over 1,200 formulas at B&B. So usually when someone's like, do you have an acid wash? I'm like, we have 5 of them. They're like, do you have a pH neutral soap? I'm like, we've got close to 100. People go,
Wow.
how's that even possible? And I'm like, there's so many kind of ways to kind of pull these things together.
So to stay on the topic of pre-washes, would you say that is in general fairly safe for your car material and your ceramic coating?
Yeah, yeah. So we design these things in order, like we know how they're going to be used, right? Especially like a touchless, frictionless wash. We know you're going to be snow lancing it, foam cannoning it onto the surface, and it's going to sit and reside for up to a minute or so, and then you're going to either pressure rinse it off, or in the case of some detailers, are going to contact wash mitt it. Traditionally, we've made these products for things like really big tractor trailers or semi truck beds and stuff like that, where it's not reasonable for you to get out there with a lamb's wool mitt and wash the entire trailer. So these things are designed to be extremely concentrated, extremely alkaline, or extremely acidic, like using hydrofluoric acid or straight caustic soda. But they also have things in there like glycol ethers and stuff, which are co-solvents, in order to stop the product from drying out, because once you dry out is where you're going to start running into staining, etching, damage. So it's cleaning, but at the same time, we have the expectation of how you're going to be putting it on any and all surfaces: glass, plastics, rubber, paint, etc. And it can't dry on the surface. So we have ingredients in there in order to prevent that too.
Yeah, sometimes you would see those trucks with the bare aluminum tanks on the side. They become matte in very little time. So those product can be very strong, but I guess if they are made for the detailing enthusiasts, they should be safe in general. Because
Right.
that's one thing that comes back all the time when I go on the topic of pre-washes. People are always worried about using them.
So let me circle back to, your comment about Adams and pre-soaks. So why someone like a marketer at Adams might feel like that's not an appropriate product for a B&B consumer or for an Adams consumer is um, if we make an alkaline wash in order to clean a truck trailer bed and it's super alkaline, very concentrated, can you imagine as an end user if you're putting that onto your, Toyota Corolla or something, and then you're taking a wash mitt to it, it's going to chew your hands up pretty bad, right? Because it's very concentrated, it's very alkaline. So in those instances, we have to usually reformulate the product in order to be more applicable to an end user. We can't just take a professional truck bed wash and then go stick it in an Adams bottle and start hawking it to every consumer who wants a pre-soak. So, just to kind of tie it all back of like, why wouldn't you just like show this to a customer? If it works so good on a trailer, wouldn't it work fantastic on someone's vehicle? And it's like, yes, but with the process in mind, we don't want people to go wash a vehicle and come away and their hands are pink and red because the strip wash or whatever was eating their skin while they were doing it because it's not intended to be used with a wash mitt, right?
So there's a lot of liability reasons there as well.
Well, and just, that's not a good experience for the end user. They don't want to come inside and be like, my hands are completely dried out and stripped. My skin itches, you know, um, it's not a good experience. So a lot of times, it's not directly transferable technologies from a professional consumer to a
Yeah.
layman end user on a weekend warrior.
But how do you balance making products for the hardcore enthusiast and the average Joe that just details in his once in a while?
That's why we have 1,200 formulas. You have to differentiate those products, and usually there's a lot of knobs and things in these formulas that we have to turn. There's ingredients we have to omit, or there's ingredients we have to add. So I think one of the things you wanted to talk about today was things like smart surfactants and things like that. There's ingredients that you can use that will get the job done just as thoroughly, just differently, right? So you can um, you can use something like a NTA, which is an acetic acid, or a chelate like EDTA to do your salt removal and water softening and stuff like that. But when you spray those products, it'll also choke you and it'll hurt your lungs a lot, and they're known carcinogens. So um, modifying formulas is usually quite necessary for cost, for toxicities, for applications, like you don't want to damage certain surfaces where it's used, or we as chemists, we just want to make a product that's not going to hurt people, right? So there's always an opportunity to lower costs in these formulas by using what we like to call cheap and nasty ingredients. But when we do those, we know we're intentionally putting people at harm or at risk of harm because we're reaching for certain ingredients that we know better, that there's other alternatives that exist, right? So when you see brands say stuff like using high quality raw materials, understand that as a consumer, translate that to they're using ingredients that are not necessarily the cheapest ingredients, but they're more engineered or they're modified in such a way that toxicity was taken into account, that gentleness to surfaces and to people was taken into account. So um, there's a lot of considerations to what I would call a cheap product versus an expensive product, and it isn't necessarily just to pad profit margins. To reach for these ingredients, it makes things more expensive.
This year I've been trying a couple pre-washes product. There's one that is called VDR certified and they put on the label risk free. And there's another one that says a bunch of things around that topic, like biodegradable and safe. And even if you let it dry, it's still safe. Would you see a product similar to that with like touchless capacities for Adams coming soon?
I would imagine so, yeah. I mean, again, my brain, when I hear those types of things, immediately starts reaching for certain chemistries out of the shelf that, again, so I'll use one example, EDTA, right? Well, we can also reach for um, a BioPure GLDA, which is a different type of chelate that'll do the same amount of work, but it doesn't come with any of the harsh side effects of the toxicities or potential staining on surfaces. So again, when they're saying those types of things on their label, I believe it's very legitimate in saying they're reaching for specific raw materials that are known to not leave residues behind, known to not damage surfaces, known to operate a different way. So, again, going back to the smart surfactants, you have certain surfactants that will clean from the top down, and you have to let them reside long enough to get through the contaminant they're trying to clean. But you also have newer technologies that will penetrate through things like residues or muck, and then they'll lift it from the surface. So, again, you hear uh, emulsification or things like that. That's what we're talking about, is it basically going down beneath it and pushing it off the surface or breaking its bonds from the surface so it lifts off much easier, um, other than just trying to kind of etch or clean its way down to the surface. So depending on what raw materials you choose, those things will literally get down to the surface, release it, but then they're also often doing things like hydrophilization, as they call it, which is leaving a little bit of a film or a layer behind in order to protect the surface and to make it easier to clean the next time you use it. And so by doing that, you're leaving something behind that contaminants now come in contact with the next time that it gets dirty, and it becomes easier to clean because that all releases off the surface, because in chemistry, like likes like, um, and repeated usages will make that surface easier to maintain, but it also, by doing so, makes that surface less prone to taking damage or getting stained.
Is that a surfactant?
So
Okay.
solvents will be that way, surfactants will be that way, chelates will be that way, different sort of polymeric ingredients will be that way. It's just kind of an overall concept around the formula and the types of ingredients you reach for.
Okay.
There's cheap and nasties where you're just like, I'm just going to smash it with alkalinity like sodium hydroxide or something and NTA, or you're like, I'm going to use novel green chelates and novel green surfactants and polymeric based surfactants that will penetrate surfaces and leave something behind, or anti-redeposition. I'm like, those are all like much more involved chemistries that are much more novel, and those tend to go through, I would say, the much more prominent brands that are willing to price their product at a premium in order to offer those types of ingredients to the consumer. So again, what I see a lot with Adams, for example, is Atoms will perform really well, but people go, but the other product's a lot cheaper. So they're cost conscious, right? They're like, I'm just going to reach for, I see a lot on YouTube videos, I'm going to use whatever is the cheapest. And I'm like, that's a perfectly valid thing to do, especially with how expensive things are these days. But you're also limiting your horizon to whatever chemistries can meet that cost point. And usually they're cheaper, they're nastier, they're not as good for your health, they're not as good for the environment, and they're not as good for the surfaces, including your skin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a trade off. So when you see these more expensive products, I would encourage your listeners to not think of it as, well, this is just a money grabbing scheme by this brand. It's probably the same stuff, just twice or three times more expensive. And I would say, that's not true necessarily. Obviously, I don't work for every brand, so I don't know. But at least with companies like Adams, I can speak to when those formulas are more expensive, it's because we're using much higher quality chemistry going into that, and there's a lot more consideration involved to your possessions as well as yourself.
So while you mentioned sodium hydroxide, this is something I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
You could pre-wash with a APC or a degreaser with sodium hydroxide and get pretty much I guess the same results. I hear it all the time with my viewers that sodium hydroxide is caustic. I know this is a dose thing. Can you elaborate and explain to us what is, maybe in general terms, what is sodium hydroxide, and is it harmful for our cars?
Sodium hydroxide is a very alkaline ingredient. You can buy it in either like beads or like a powder, which is what they call anhydrous, or um, you can buy it pre-dissolved in water. It's like a 50% solution. We use it in formulations as either a pH adjuster, so you can use it to neutralize ingredients. So if you're making a soap that has dodecylbenzene sulfonic acid, DDBSA, and you need to neutralize it to make it the sulfonate salt to make it a soap, you're going to add some caustic to it. Now, the reality is you're going to add just enough caustic to neutralize the DDBSA, but not much beyond that. So there's no what we call excess alkalinity. In other formulas, the caustic is going to be very corrosive. So in like an APC, you can use it as just a neat raw material to give you alkalinity, but also just to give you a corrosive element that's going to eat through different contaminants like carbonaceous soils, like burnt on ingredients, or really deep um, films or dirts and muds and stuff like that. It's going to chew through that really well. The issue there is if you're applying it to an entire surface, you're going to have some surfaces that are very dirty and the caustic's going to be working on the dirt. And then you're going to have other parts of your car that are not very dirty and the ingredients don't care what it's working on. It'll just work on something. So then it can start chewing into your plastics or your glass or something like that. So usually that's the issue is you're applying something very uniformly to a surface that is not contaminated uniformly. So that's where you got to be careful of having like that excess alkalinity. So things like caustic will also flag products as corrosive for transport because it's very corrosive to metals, also to skin, but it becomes hazardous to transport because it can eat metals. So switching out that caustic to something like sodium metasilicate in some instances can give you the alkalinity you need without the corrosivity that you have from something like potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, which are just basically straight caustic. It would chew your skin up real bad. Like
Okay.
we've had employees that have gotten caustic on them and it's literally like eaten through their skin. They've had to have their foot or their hand debrided to get all of the like dead flesh out because once it gets on you, it tries to seep through your skin and it can really chew you up. Same thing with acids, right? So people hear acid, super dangerous. I watched Breaking Bad and they melted a guy with acid. I'm like, you can do the same thing with caustic. Caustic is
Okay.
every bit as dangerous as acid, if not more so in some cases.
We've seen them if you look at the SDS of many APC, you'll see sodium hydroxide. I even saw it on Mr. Clean bottle, right?
Right.
So
And all things in moderation, right? Or what I said earlier in the podcast, context. So sometimes with a lot of these SDSs and things, we have to list every hazardous ingredient that's in the blend. And then with California Right to Know in section 15, you have to list all ingredients, period, hazardous and non-hazardous down to 0.1%. So even if we're using caustic in a formula and it's in there at like, 0.1% in order to pH the blend, you basically need to list it on the SDS because you might have some unreacted sodium hydroxide in your formula. In some cases, like in the case of the DDBSA I said earlier, you're going to neutralize it and you should have basically no sulfonic acid left and you should have almost no caustic left because when you have an acid and a base, you get a salt, the sulfonate, and water. However, we're not in a perfect world. Maybe the blenders or whoever produced the product didn't get the ratios perfectly right, or you down to a molar ratio, you didn't get every single reaction you were looking for. So you have to list those ingredients in there. So just because you see sodium hydroxide in there doesn't mean, oh yeah, they dumped a ton of that in there and it's going to eat your face off if you get it on you. That's not true. But it could. Like you could get a formula where they list sodium hydroxide and it's the one of the principal raw materials in the formula and it is quite corrosive and very harmful. So usually that's why I say wear glasses, wear gloves. If you get chemistry on you, wash it off, regardless of whether it's a pH neutral soap or an alkaline APC or an acid. I'm like, chemistry in your flesh really shouldn't.
so the version that you mentioned, starting with an M, I don't want to mispronounce it. That's a similar version, but much safer and not corrosive. Is that right?
Not corrosive until you get to a certain concentration, right? So different ingredients can give you alkalinity, like the metasilicate will give you buffering at about a pH 13. The caustic itself will get you to a pH of 13 very similarly and very quickly, but in a more corrosive fashion, if that makes any sense. And that's,
Okay.
without getting too technical, it's based on how the chemistry works, how it's donating ions to the solution, or how it's scavenging ions from the solution.
In the end, when people are leaving comments or they're giving their thoughts on those ingredients, there's so many factors in the recipe. If I can say that, that change the real answer in the end. So we're we're
Again,
arguing for
I
no
feel like
reason, right?
I feel like I'm saying a lot while at the same time you're kind of expanding on. I don't know if you really answered that question. Um, it's complicated, right? Because it's all within context. I've said in other like calls and stuff like that, saying something is a fruit doesn't mean an apple and an orange are the same thing because they have seeds. It's very different. But both of them can give you similar amounts of nutrition. So it's the same thing with chemistry. It's like, oh, well, this is alkaline, that's alkaline, they're the same. I'm like, no, they work different ways despite having the same pH. So different corrosivities, different abilities to clean, different contributions to how the formula works, both the same pH.
And then you mentioned earlier that uh, when we dilute a concentrate product, that's normally reduce or increase the pH. So this is one question I wanted to ask. If let's say I use a pH 12 and I dilute it at 1 to 50 in the well, at the end dilution would be 1 to 50. How far would that bring down the pH from pH 12?
Depending on what's in the formula, a lot of cleaners, what you'll see is for every one fold dilution. So if you went 1 to 1 and then 1 to 2 and then 1 to 3, for each level of dilution you're doing there, the pH will maybe adjust by about 0.1. So
Oh,
in cases like doing a 50 to 1, you might have a drop of a pH of about a half a point. So if you're at 12, you might go down to 11, 11 and a half. And people go, how is that possible? And it's because there's there's ingredients that as you dilute the system, it pushes more ions into the system. So basically balances the pH back out. And it's designed that way specifically so that we can make a product that's very highly concentrated. When you dilute it 50-fold, it doesn't turn into a fancy bottle of water. It's still quite active. And it's because we're anticipating you're going to dilute it that way. But you also see on the label, it'll basically say, do not use this as is. You need to dilute this. There's even laws around that, right? Like you can't sell it as VOC compliant or safe for a consumer unless you have on the label, you better dilute this. Um, and it's not recommended to be used as is. And you'll still see
okay.
detailers go, I'm using it as is because I'm going to go ham on this project. But the reality is the company then isn't liable for what happens to your surfaces or what happens to you, because as formulators, we're telling the marketers and the companies selling these formulas, you have to have on your label to dilute this.
So I guess if you dilute the same soap of pH 12 in a 20-liter or for a 5-gallon bucket, that would work. Since the dilution is a higher, that would bring down more the pH towards neutral.
Right, right. So you can eventually dilute it to oblivion and get it to go to a pH of 7 or whatever. But the reality is it depends on what's in there. So again, same thing with like something like caustic. You're going to have ions that's donating or scavenging until you get to a certain limit, and then basically it'll fall off a cliff and it'll go to neutral. Something like a metasilicate might buffer it harder so that you can dilute it further and still have that alkalinity. So again, different reasons why we as formulators would reach for different ingredients for formulas. What are you trying to accomplish? But
Okay,
again, it's not like, okay, so this raw in all instances is always better than this raw material. I'm like, that's not true either. Like it's all in context.
very good. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I have many more questions regarding chemistry, soaps, APC, or specific ingredients, but
Sure.
let's shift a little bit towards ceramic coating. By the way, guys at home, we probably gonna have a few more episodes on the subject, so make sure to leave your question down below. I have many more questions, but in order to keep this in a reasonable amount of time, I'm gonna switch the focus for ceramic coatings. Is there such a thing as cracking or fracturing the ceramic coating, meaning
Yeah.
once it's applied on the car?
I have seen some coatings. Usually they were someone trying to sell me a coating to then use in my formulas that I sell to my customers. Um, but there is the possibility of building too much cross-linking and not enough flexibility that I've seen or heard of vehicles that had a very substantial amount of coating on a car. The applicator turned as hard as a baseball. The consumer's really stoked and they're like, I've got like a Batmobile armored vehicle now. And then as they drive it, I've heard of one specific instance that I recall where the vehicle cracked. Like it looked like the clear coat, like spider webbed, like if you took like a baseball bat to a windshield or something and it's like spider webs out. So I do think that there's the ability to make it too concentrated that you can actually get to a point where the coating is brittle because it's so hard. And most ceramic coatings, they're polymeric, they're conformal to the surface. So they basically are so thin that they follow the curvature of the surface. And if you could ever get some of the coating available, you can see it's kind of got some flex to it before it snaps. So these coatings are technically a little bit flexible. So I don't think most end users are going to ever have to worry about a coating cracking on their car. But I have heard of it existing.
But meaning the cracking thing would happen between heat and cold cycles, and that would make your coating fail or start to slow sheet at the bottom, for
I
example.
would I would think this is more of a physical property. So I don't think heat and cold would have anything to do with it. I think it would just literally be like torsional forces or like, twists or like bends that could cause it to break. But typically, what I see that causes coatings to start failing or having flattening is something changing to the surface energy of it, right? So, in the case of salts, they're going to be very high energy. They're going to take the water droplets and they're going to flatten it out by pulling on the edges of the water droplet with surface energy. So, you're going to see a coating start sheeting and you're like, oh, it's because the coating has failed. And I'm like, not necessarily. Some cases, yes, maybe if they're just sort of a fancy silicone coating and they're not necessarily actually ceramic, you could start seeing the cleaner or the salts or the wash start making the coating fail. But most often than not, what you're seeing is something changing to the surface energy. What I see that makes coatings quote unquote fail a lot is bug remover. And the reason for that is it's got a lot of EB and DB, which is your um, ethylene glycol monobutyl ether um,
Hmm.
or diether. Your those are coalescing agents, or they're going to cause water to flatten very aggressively. So when you use something like a bug remover on the surface, and then they wash the panel, and they go, "Oh, the bug remover killed it." I've actually educated some customers on take that panel, put it outside, wait a day so it can dry back out, and then watch the hydrophobics bounce right back. So they call a test a fail. And I'm like contacting these people and I'm like, can you wash that or can you hit that panel with water again tomorrow and see if it still failed? And they wash it again tomorrow and they're like, holy shit, it bounced back. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, do I edit my video now and say, never mind, sorry, that didn't actually fail? I'm like, no, that's not like necessarily important, but it's important to understand like some of the chemistries have ingredients that are going to flatten water. So when you're doing these like heads up challenges, you're going to make something look like it artificially failed when it necessarily didn't. In the case of real life, getting road films, salts, all that sort of stuff onto your vehicle will make your coating look like it failed, even if it necessarily hasn't. In my experience, the only way to physically remove a legitimate ceramic coating is physical abrasion. You're not going to be able to like when we've put these resins and stuff on surfaces like glass, you'll see it's like glass on glass. There's no amount of scrubbing with Dawn dish soap or something that you're going to be able to apply to get that coating to fail. But what you could do to it is abrade it enough that it eventually comes off the surface, or you screw up the surface topography such that it no longer beads, it now sheets. Does that
Okay.
make any sense?
Yeah, I was going to say because right now I'm testing three different coatings on my car. It was applied the same way at the same time, and the initial behavior was pretty similar, meaning that the beating was great all across the board. But now, like 3 months later, during the winter, after I maintained them, they look very much different. There's one that is still beating like day one. There's one that is struggling with the beating, but kind of fast sheeting, and the other one is a middle, is in the between the both of them. Is the one that's sheeting slowly starting to fail earlier, or what is it?
So when you make these coatings, you have the actual silazane resins themselves in there, but you have a bunch of other secondary ingredients. Sometimes they're like aminofunctional silicones or some sort of trimethoxysilicate resins and things like that, right? So what you're basically describing is durability versus longevity. So I saw one of your questions was having higher solids in a coating gives it more durability. And I would say no, having higher solids in a coating gives it more longevity for the same level of durability. So durability to me as a formulator means what can it withstand before it fails? Longevity means how long does it give you that performance before it fails? Um, Maybe I didn't quite say that exactly right, but essentially, I've given the example of like sheets of paper, right? If you have a ream this thick and a ream this thick, both of them are made of sheets of paper. It's the same durability. You could damage them the same way. But if you're damaging them uniformly, one's going to fail before the other because it has a higher film build, thereby a longer longevity, a higher longevity. So in the case of the products you're seeing on the vehicle, they could have different secondary ingredients, and that's why some of them are more susceptible to the environmental wear they're seeing. Some of them might have higher solids innately, and so it's doing better, even though it has the same durability as the others. It just looks like it's doing better because you have more layers to chew through before it's going to start failing. And then others might have sort of like kinks in their armor where a specific ingredient or specific type of salt it's particularly prone to, and so it fails prematurely because it got exposed to something that it really can't withstand. But maybe it's really durable against other things, right? So it's essentially like whatever's in the environment, it wasn't engineered for that, or the formulator didn't take into account it's going to be used in this type of environment where there's a lot of mag chloride. Like, hey, I made my coating in Dubai, and then someone in Montreal is like, this coating's crap because it didn't survive the winter here, and they're like, oh yeah, I didn't really formulate it for winter because I'm in somewhere hot and humid. Um, that was kind of a lesson we learned very early on with the coatings, is we manufactured our coatings in Colorado. So, as Adam has always liked to say, everything detailing works in Colorado because it's a temperate climate, mild temperature usually, little to no humidity. So it's like everything works beautifully in Colorado. But then you take it to Florida or something, and you're like, this formula that was amazing in Colorado is total dog shit down here. It's gummy, it's tacky, it's streaky, it's terrible. And it's like, what changed? It's the humidity and the temperature. Um, so in some cases, a coating might not have the necessary ingredients in it to be hardy enough to stand up to something like a winter climate with a lot of salt.
So the one that is failing the fastest or the quickest was the easiest to apply. Is there a correlation between ease of use and durability?
In my experience, yes, maybe that's not necessarily um obviously it's a generalization, right? So all generalizations are technically false in some instances, but most coatings, the ingredients you're putting into them are very tacky and very sticky. So the more you have in the formula to higher your solids, the more your ease of use is going to have to either be counterbalanced with some other ingredient, or it's just going to suffer for that durability. Um, or things like parts of the process, like the wipe on is fine, but the wipe off is a bear. Um, so more often than not, having a formula that has a lot more solvent in it and a lot less solids should be easier to apply, right? Because you're wiping solvent on the surface and wiping it back off. That's not going to be very difficult. Um, Taking something like a really high molecular weight resin that's very syrupy, like honey, that's going to be a lot harder to wipe on the surface, let it tack up and then wipe it back off the surface, right? You know, if I
Hmm.
gave you a bottle of IPA versus a bottle of honey, you're going to be like, the honey was an awful experience. Um, so typically, yes, if you use a coating and it's considerably easy to use and it's like almost idiot proof, you can rest assured it's almost certainly probably very low solids.
There's a lot of people fighting over what's the hardest thing on our ceramic coatings between the sun, like the sun for Arizona, Vegas, for example, or the salt on the road in the Northeast, or the road film from the UK. So, what would be, in your opinion, the hardest thing for our ceramic coatings?
To me, it's anything that's going to introduce salts. So I would say the UK and the Northeast, all these salts they're putting on the road, all the films that come from them. I think anyone that's lived in those areas can attest to when you go to wash your vehicle, you must do a contact wash because those salts are extremely stubborn, right? You'll wash the vehicle, it'll look fine while it's wet, and then after it dries, you can take your finger and you can still feel it. It feels super rough. You can still see the salt sitting on the vehicle. Your plastic trim looks faded out. They're very durable ingredients, and they have to be, right? Because they're putting them on the road. If as soon as cars drove over them and the salt just ran off the road, wouldn't work very well. So even in some instances, these salts they're putting on the road isn't just salts. They're also polymers and ingredients that are trying to get those salts to stay put. Um, so those things are all going to be introducing high energy ions to the surface that are going to make water flatten out. And again, like I said, even if you have a glass type coating still on the surface, you're losing a lot of the benefit of it by the water flattening out and getting very like sticky, as I call it. And people get pissed and they say my coating failed. And in reality, I think there's products coming out all the time, or there's products that already exist that are really good at decontaminating the coating and making it bounce back. I think in
That
some instances, yeah, maybe the damage is catastrophic enough where the residue becomes so ingrained in the coating that to get rid of the residue, you're also basically getting rid of the coating. Like, yeah, I think I could see coatings fail in that instance. To me personally, if it's a fully ceramic coating, a full ceramic coating, like in the truest sense, sun shouldn't be damaging it. The sun is going to work uh, a lot of damage into organic coatings, like your polyurethane um, clear coat or your PPFs and stuff like that, because they're organic. So it's donating radical scavengers from the sun, and it's breaking bonds with the surface to make bonds with the high energy photons from the sun. But in the case of a coating, if it's legitimately an inorganic coating, it doesn't interact with photons. So I wouldn't subscribe to the sun as damaging coatings personally.
okay? Okay, very good. And to go back to the salt thing, so in the winter I get a very thick crust of salt. My viewers already know. So I wash the car with the pre-wash and pH neutral soap with a contact wash. And the lower panels, they almost look chalky. So the paint is as clean as I can get it, right? It doesn't, there's nothing on the surface with my eyes that I can see. But the lower panels, they look chalky. So now I'm waiting to use an acidic product eventually. But is that a side effect of the salt?
So those things can get really embedded in the surface. So sometimes they can get almost subsurface. So even though you're using a contact wash, you might just be skating over the top of it and you're not actually getting down into the pores of the surface and getting those things cleaned out. Essentially, like as you're washing, it's just kind of sitting over the top and then coming back off. So I said it very early on in the program, but you have to solubilize those salts. And in most cases, they're insoluble in water, meaning they don't dissolve in water. So it doesn't matter that you're using a pH neutral wash, it doesn't matter that you have surfactants, they're not being solubilized. So you're not actually removing them. So that's why introducing things that have free ions, like an acid, is going to change um, the chemistry of those salts and thereby make them soluble in water so that then they can be removed.
Okay.
Again, maybe we have to go into more depth of it on another call because it's fairly technical, but that's the issue is you're trying to solubilize the salts. It's not solubilizing them.
That was very good. So that just confirmed what I thought. And what product? Well, I have two acidic product I want to try going forward to fix that. But in the Adams lineup, would that be the strip wash? Since you said that it's now an acidic product, what would be the best product to get that out?
Yeah, and in the Adams lineup, it would be either their water spot remover, or something like the strip wash. The strip wash has sulfamic acid in it, which is a cousin to sulfuric acid. Um, Basically, the principal ingredient that goes into a lot of salt terminators or salt removers, especially in the marine environment. So that'd be something I would reach for in that lineup.
Okay, and those soap you gotta really follow the dilution rate, because if it's not enough concentrated, you lose the acidity, right? So what's the dilution rate for strip wash?
Ooh, I can't recall. I believe it's
Yeah,
supposed to
okay.
be 1 to 128. So that's basically 1 ounce for every gallon of water if you're using a bucket wash, or if you're in a foam cannon. It's a 35-ounce foam cannon. You'd use 3.5 fluid ounces of the soap and then QS with water to volume. Like in those products, if you dilute them too heavy, the sulfamic acid won't buffer enough, so you'll essentially nullify it. I think I saw a video of someone doing that recently with like Labo Cosmetica and stuff like
Hmm.
that, where they diluted them.
Yeah, and most of them were losing their acidity other than the Labo product. I've seen that video. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I watched it and it made me debate doing an update to the strip wash because of, that fact, right? It's like maybe we don't have enough sulfamic acid.
Yeah, because people they're just gonna eyeball the amount of soap in their 5 gallon bucket, just like when they use the neutral pH soap. So
Yeah, and then you
that's
have
gonna
people
defeat the
that are
purpose.
not cost conscious and they're like, I'm gonna use quarter of this bottle in my foam cannon. And I'm like, power to you. But then they're like, it works fantastic. I'm like, of course it did.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions from the listener, but we're just gonna be able to do two of those.
Okay.
So I picked up from my friend Mike G. So Mike G introduced me to Chris. So let's go with his two questions that he's got for you. The difference between Adams ceramic coatings and the Jades. The Jades is the brand at B&B, right?
Totally different resins. So the resins we're using in the Atoms products are specific to Atoms. It was a very important thing early on in the development process that they wanted that differentiation. Since we're sister companies, obviously I was forced to oblige. Um, but the Jade products, again, they're more tailored towards a specific set of professional and prosumer type customers, whereas Atoms, as you might have heard on a lot of videos, Joe says, they kind of cater to more entry level consumers or people that are not necessarily prosumers. So the coatings for Atoms, I would say, are a lot more accommodating to end use than something like the Jades are. I've had a lot of people use a Jade coating and say, "Oh, it wasn't as easy as an Atoms," and I'm like, "Yeah, I mean that's by design." And they're like, "Well, I thought they were the same thing." I'm like, "They're not." Um, but that's the point, right? Is like, so a Jade is it's a B&B house brand in order to try and assist private label customers that do not want or do not have the ability to create their own ceramic coating lineup, but they want to be able to offer ceramic coatings because there's a lot that goes into creating a ceramic coating brand. Adams, they have their own end users in mind. They have their own customer they're targeting. They have their own price points, and they have their own technical team that are very adamant when I bring them formulas of tweaking it into their own specifics that they want to have it. Like they know what their customer wants. So when I bring them something like a Jade, they're like, works great, too hard to use.
Mhm.
Um, so that sort of thing.
So that means that you probably can talk about the strongest ceramic coating that you've made in your work, meaning that it's not at Adams for now.
No, it certainly isn't. Yeah, we have coatings at B&B that, especially going into the marine space, are extremely active. Like almost the whole bottle is resin. But it's
Wow.
because there's specific users involved that we're like, you do realize this is going to be very important that you apply this correctly, right? Whereas if we gave this to end users, we just have a flurry of like, I fucked my car up.
Yeah, we gotta remember that Adams is available at the auto parts store, so nobody, everyone can pick it up. And we've seen the horror stories where they haven't wiped off the ceramic. They applied it like a wax, and they
Yep.
screwed the whole clear coat.
Yep.
Last question from Mike G, my friend Mike G. He wants to know, what's your take on the nano diamonds ceramic coatings?
I So in someone in my position, I get pestered a lot with borafine. What is this? Is this better than what we have? Why aren't we making borafine? Oh, silicon carbide. That's the newest thing. Chris, we need a silicon carbide coating. Why haven't you developed this? Just endless stuff like that, right? Um, in some cases, it's like something like borafine. It's a fancy way of saying graphene. So it's marketing spin to some extent. The nano diamonds, I think that's pretty legitimate, to be honest. There's research papers you can read on things like nano detonation technologies, and um, I think like things like the detonation really sort of set people off into this like really weird misunderstanding of like it's literally an explosion. I'm like, I don't think it's actually an explosion. It's the process under a lot of temperature and pressure and stuff like that in order to create some of these conformal structures on these polymer chains to give you resins. I think a lot like the criticism that's been lobbed at the graphene coatings. Does this fancy technology offer you anything better than just a typical organo polysilazane or something like that? I'd say like opinions are mixed. I think at the end of the day, what's more important is, are you reaching for some sort of a polysilazane technology at all? Or are you using something that's kind of a fancy silicone and it's got marketing spin to say it's a ceramic, right? So I think the nano diamond thing probably has some legitimacy to it. There's probably a little bit of a marketing spin to it. The graphene thing, just like in ours, very legitimate. It's graphene oxide technology, but it gets spun as graphene, and I have to defend a lot. Like, we as the chemists don't say it's a graphene coating. We say it's a graphene oxide modified ceramic coating.
Mhm.
So as always, there's like a maybe an intentional or unintentional mistranslation from the chemist to the marketer to the consumer, right? It's almost a game of telephone. You're like, this has diamonds in it. They're like, they said this has diamonds in it. This thing is literally made of diamonds. And it's like, no, that is not true. Like I had a marketing guy that would get too overzealous and he'd be like, the coatings are harder than diamonds because they're 10H. And I'm like, 10H is a pencil. I was like, you're talking Mohs scale, which is 10 on the Mohs scale. I'm like, we're still goofing around down near graphite, which is like a 2 to 3. He's like, you said it was a 10H. Isn't a 10H a diamond? I'm like, no. So it's like a complete misunderstanding, but he was genuinely like pitching it that way. And I'm like, I have to like pull it back and say like, no, 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 you're misinterpreting what I explained to you. Or
Mhm.
the example with like carnauba, right? Is we melt down 100% carnauba flakes, like literally pull them out of the drum and they're carnauba flake. And the marketer says made with 100% carnauba. I'm like, no, the blend is 33% carnauba. There's petroleum distillates, there's silicones, there's all these other ingredients to make it into a paste wax, but they market it as this is a can of 100% carnauba. And I'm like, no, like that's not true. And then we get, people that kind of get educated and go, hey, I think this is kind of bullshit. We get lobbed as the chemist made something that's bullshit. And I'm like, we didn't make something that's bullshit. It was very legitimate. It gets twisted or misunderstood or mismarketed into something
Yeah,
it's not.
there's lots of crazy claims out there, crazy marketing
Yeah,
schemes.
I think we're going to see regulation in the near future of like, especially playing in the Canadian market. You can't say this lasts longer than a conventional wax. They're like, how much longer? What data do you have to support it? And relative to what? Like, you have
Yeah.
to actually support the claim. Whereas in the US, cosmetics went that way, right? They would say on their cosmetics commercials, we'll make you look 5 years younger. They're like, how the hell do you support that? And they're like, okay, gives you a more youthful appearance. There, we'll say it that way. Because saying you will look five years younger, it's like you can't say that. And now car care is going that way too, where it's like will last 3.5 years. It's like prove it. You're like, don't really have data to support that. They're like, then you can't say that.
Yeah, that's crazy. I can't wait to dive more into those advertised durability stuff and all that good stuff. You have anything we forget before? Anything that you wanted to mention before we go?
No, I just appreciate you giving me the chance to come on here. I genuinely enjoy talking about this sort of stuff. No interest of mine to promote any specific brand or product or anything like that. I, like myself, am learning more about things every day, and I like imparting some of my experience and knowledge to the rest of the viewership in the community. This is kind of my favorite part about detailing, or at least in terms of like modern detailing, is like the connection of the technical with the commercial, with the process and stuff, and like that there's those channels to have those conversations. Whereas, I can imagine way back when Turtle Wax was young, there was no chemist getting on a podcast to talk about the chemistry. It's just like you stay in the lab, you make the chemistry, and then we put a turtle with a can. Um, I think now there's a lot more like transparency and a lot more back and forth communication, and I just think it makes everybody a lot more intelligent. So I can appreciate that, and thank you for giving me a chance to be on your platform today.
Thank you so much, Chris. You have any social media or any projects that you want to plug away?
No, I certainly don't. I don't like being in camera a lot.
Okay, that's fine. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate having you on, and the fact that you can explain our question in regular kind of language that's really helpful for me and for the audience. So thank you so much for coming here, and I can't wait to get you back on, my friend.
Thanks. I'd love to do it again.